panelists at the IEA and the International Energy Agency. And in this session, the agency would like to discuss some key themes of the forthcoming publication, Africa Energy Outlook. And these include mainly 3-4 pillars. One is the energy system transformation and the efforts to simultaneously achieve universal energy access. The second is improved energy security and affordability. And the third is, of course, the climate angle, so reducing emissions consistently with Africa's climate objectives and also the Paris Agreement, and increase financial flows from international actors. So the report, which is going to be published later this year, aims to be one of the primary inputs to COP27 in Egypt. And we hope that this can provide the latest data on the investment needs, on the energy mix, and the financial flows to realize all Africa energy, climate, and development goals. So this session, we are planning for it to last around 60 minutes, and will consist of, we're gonna have a panel discussion. We are quite lucky to have already here one panelist in person. We're waiting for another panelist in person to come. And then we're also blessed to have other speakers connected online. Welcome to everyone who is connected. And we are gonna hear first some introductory remarks from Mr. Tom House, who is the head of the Energy and Environment Division at the International Energy Agency. And then I'm gonna pass it over to my colleague Daniel Wetzel, who is the head of Trucking Sustainable Transition Unit at the IEA. And then finally, we're gonna have a panel discussion, and we are going to have some Q&A at the end. So if you have some questions, please raise them to them. Good morning, please. We are now joined by our last panelist, so perfect, right on time. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to my colleague Tom House for some opening remarks. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luca, and hello to everybody. Welcome. I'm glad some of you made it to Bonn, and I hope the sessions have started well. We're at a very different place from where we were last year in terms of preparing for COP. The invasion of Ukraine has completely disrupted the global energy system. It's caused such impacts that it threatens to derail efforts to tackle the world's critical challenge of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change. However, the crisis has also made the benefits of the energy transition much clearer. The benefits of accelerating energy efficiency measures, of deploying renewable energy, these have become more apparent than ever. And this is as true for Africa as for anywhere else. With Africa, though, we have the energy crisis, we have risks to food security, as well as the impacts of climate change. All of these are having a profound effect and need to be addressed as much as possible within the framework of Africa's energy development. So within our forthcoming African Energy Outlook for 2022, we want to explore a pathway for Africa to and Africa's energy system that fully considers all the different risks that African leaders face. But we want one that maps a viable way forward that helps achieve all African development goals, including universal access to energy, as well as all Africa's nationally determined contributions and announced net zero pledges, so combining the SDG goals. The report, which will be released on 20th of June with our partners, the Africa Union Commission and UNECA, and we very much hope that it will be a useful analytical roadmap for African leaders as they prepare for COP27. And that's really why we wanted to preview the report here today, to have a great discussion with our esteemed panelists on what they believe will be the top energy agenda items for African leaders at COP27. We also wanted to discuss one of the critical challenges of the next decade, which is mobilizing the need for investments in Africa, both for mitigation and for adaptation. So we hope to cover a lot today, and we start this. I very much look forward to the discussion But to set the scene, we started with a presentation from one of the report's lead authors, Dan Betzel, head of the Tracking Sustainable Transitions Unit within the World Energy Outlook team. Over to you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate it. And great pleasure to be with these panelists today to discuss some of the previews from our report that will be coming out. So the forthcoming Africa Energy Outlook 2022 is not that far distant from the last iteration in which we did, which was in 2019 for our Africa Energy Outlook. But we know full well that much has changed in the world since 2019. So right now we're sort of seeing the two dual crises, one of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic implications of that, as well as the current energy crisis brought upon by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are both really reshaping what is possible going forward in energy development, and also what is possible economically in many countries. So we see that these impacts are driving up costs for food, fuel, and fertilizer, and sending prices soaring, and is most severely hurting those in the developing world where we know people can least afford it. And this comes at a really bad time, as many countries, in order to endure the economic impacts of COVID-19, have exhausted a huge amount of financial resources to keep food and fuel, again, affordable for its people. And this has pushed, in Africa and alone, about 22 countries into debt distress. And many of them are now facing tough decisions in terms of looking at how to handle that debt while keeping things affordable for their people. So these have really influenced how we see the route forward for many countries, but we also recognize that leading up to COP26 in Glasgow, and in that process, there's been a lot of good news for the world in terms of climate and the availability of climate finance. So we see, as of March 2022, countries representing over 70% of global CO2 emissions have committed to reach net zero in around the middle of this century or shortly thereafter, including 12 in Africa. And this is the first time that we really see a path charting an opportunity for the world, if all of these pledges were met on time and in full, and that is a big if, for the globe to reach 2 degrees Celsius if those were fully fulfilled, or so under 2 degrees Celsius, sorry. And these commitments we see are also reshaping what is going to be possible going forward. That is not only what is possible in terms of technology, bringing renewables down faster, as well as energy efficiency, but also what we see in terms of the availability of financing. We're seeing both global commitments to ramp up the availability of climate finance and other streams, as well as also making fossil fuel investments or fossil heavy investments harder going forward. So our new Africa Energy Outlook tries to take into consideration all of these different factors and says what is going to be plausible and possible in that route forward. And in this pathway, what we see is both the realization of all African energy goals, all stated NDCs, as well as also the full achievement of SDG 7, universal access to both clean cooking and electricity by 2030. So within that construct, what we see is in the next decade, modern energy demand grows by 1/3 to 2030, both driven by universal access, as well as households ramping up their energy use and more African businesses using energy for productive activities. One of the key aspects of the roadmap is how do smartly designed energy and efficiency policies help keep these costs affordable for Africans, because we know that there are pressing challenges globally where the world is exporting low efficiency appliances and secondhand cars to Africa, which contributes to growing fuel import burdens, as well as additional strains on Africa's grid. And so smart efficiency policy is one of the key cornerstones that can help manage these affordability issues, as well as all these systemic issues. Additionally, a growing amount of this energy demand is going to be met by renewables. Renewable electricity represents about 80% of all new generation capacity added from today to 2030. And this is both in distributed, so solar home systems, renewable mini grids, and also on the grid. Additionally, commitments to end financing for new coal power, particularly notably China's commitment to stop building coal power abroad, are really reshaping what is possible. We saw about 15 gigawatts of coal projects that were in the planning phases, but not yet under construction, come offline effectively. Those will now be supplanted by solar and natural gas in some contexts in Africa going forward. There are a few venues, though, that we recognize that in the pursuit of universal access, that fossil fuels will be needed. One is particularly in LPG for reaching clean cooking objectives by 2030. Another one is natural gas in industry, where other opportunities for providing low emissions heat are not yet ready nor commercially viable to support the ramp up of African industries. But the most important thing to note is that production of African natural gas and oil focuses increasingly on meeting domestic demand as opposed to export markets going forward, as we see global demand for these declining along with stated objectives for decarbonization. However, there are many new prospects brought about in export markets, notably in critical minerals. So we're talking copper, cobalt, magnesium, manganese, etc. All of these things are needed to build the clean energy we need in a global pathway going forward. Today, Africa controls about 15% of global production, and we see these levels potentially quadrupling over the next 10 years in terms of total revenues. Additionally, green hydrogen, we're seeing a lot of new high-profile projects underway or under discussion, particularly for the production of ammonia, which is critically important at this juncture. Given the situation of global fertilizer prices and food prices skyrocketing. And so many of these projects are presenting a very promising way forward with fully delivered costs of production of green hydrogen in Africa, being able to be delivered to markets in Northern Europe at the same prices as producing it there. So these are very promising developments. Now, the key pieces, as Tom mentioned before, is how do we mobilize the needed levels of investment in Africa? So what we see is over the next decade, energy investment needs to double. And in clean energy investment specifically, we see a 6-fold increase by 2030. This really calls for the international financial community to make more energy investment a critical priority in the coming decade. And most importantly is how do we increase the level of concessional aid, both through grants and low-cost financing? And then secondly, how do we better use that concessional aid to mobilize greater support from the private sector? And in particular, tapping into both local domestic markets, and there's many great examples in our report of how this has been done really successfully. A great example is Room to Run in Nigeria, as well as some of the examples that TDB is doing in Kenya. But how do we better and more strategically use these sources of concessional aid to ramp up energy investment? So the key piece is how do we unlock this investment? And our executive director has been very forthcoming about saying one of the priorities for the forthcoming COP27 is how do we make this financial agenda and this discussion on better mobilizing financial resources a priority in those discussions. And the last thing I just wanted to highlight about this roadmap is the emissions pathway for Africa. To date, we know no more than 3% of global cumulative energy-related CO2 emissions have come from Africa since 1890, when we started sort of have a good record of production there. In any global scenario, this pathway that we've laid out would mean that Africa would contribute by no more than 4% of global emissions cumulatively by 2050. And so I think this really underscores the international community has an undeniable role in finding a way to mobilize the needed investments in Africa's energy systems, as well as the adaptation finance that we know is so critical today. So with that, I just want to leave. Thank you guys again for having me. I'm really excited to hear this discussion about how energy can figure into the agenda of African negotiators at COP. And we recognize as the IEA that this is the critical decade, not only for global climate action, but for making the foundational investments in energy infrastructure in Africa to be able to support the flourishing of African economies and support the world's youngest population as it comes of age with the development of Africa. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks also to Tom. We've seen that the overview, the very effective overview that Dan provided now gave a sense of the challenges but also the opportunities that are there coming up in the next decade and also going forward to 2050 for the African continent. And I would like to discuss with the panel today a little bit of more in depth, a little bit these challenges. So let me introduce first our panelists that are here. We're very lucky, of course, to have such a distinguished panel, both in person but also virtually. So I would invite also the colleagues that are connected virtually to please put on your cameras. So let me introduce first from my far left here in person, Mr. Ousmane Sarr, who is a member of the National Committee on Climate Change of Senegal and is also the coordinator of the West African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance. Welcome. And then closer to on my left, we have Stephen Nzioka, Senior Deputy Director of Renewable Energy and the Ministry of Energy in Kenya. And welcome as well. And then we have two distinguished speakers joining us virtually. We have Mr. Mesfin Dabi Seboka, who is a Senior Energy Analyst in the Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy in Ethiopia. And then Mr. Abdullahi Ahmed Ali, sorry if I mispronounce any of the names, environmental specialist at the Ministry of Energy and Water Resources in Somalia. So welcome all. And I would like to pose to start with a question directed to the whole panel. Perhaps we can go in the order that I just introduced, so starting from Ousmane Sarr and then finalizing with Ahmed Ali. So the first is a very high-level question. So we know that the next COP is going to be hosted in Africa, in Egypt. So it's a very important COP for the continent. So what do you think is the top priority for the African continent and for the African countries heading into COP27 climate negotiations? So Ousmane Sarr, if you want to start, please.
Thank you, dear moderator, and good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me in this panel, where I will have the opportunity to share our views and experience in the sub-region in West Africa. That is the region I know mostly in Africa. So, responding to your question, I think the main issue that we need to address for the coming COP is the issue of energy transition, because as you have already said, if we take into consideration the current situation that we are living, and due to the fact that this crisis that we are all that is impacting all our countries, the Ukrainian and Russian crisis. You know, if you follow the media, that in Africa we have something that is really critical in terms of food security and in terms of energy access. This is something that we need to tackle very carefully when it comes to energy transition. Transitioning is not something that we can do overnight. We have to go through it on a very progressive manner and taking into consideration all local circumstances and challenges that we are currently living in our country. So in terms of consideration for oil and gas in our Sahelian countries, I think it is something that we need to address when it comes to discuss about energy transition during next COP. Because I can take the case of my own country, Senegal, for example, where we are fossil dependent in the energy sector. And nevertheless, the government is doing a lot in terms of renewable energy penetration. In these last 10 years, we've moved from less than 5% up to 30% for the integration of renewable energy in our electricity mix. So this is considerable. But as the country has now starting producing, will start soon producing oil and gas, the energy mix in Senegal will be mostly based on gas. And from the government point of view, gas should be considered as a bridging technology toward net zero. And in a few months ago, you all were aware of the fact that the financing of fossil fuel was very problematic for our countries. And in order to implement or to realize investment in the energy sector in our country, you need a lot of financial resources and accessible financial resources. So if we don't have concessional loans, if we don't have support for private sector involvement in terms of financial resources, I think it would be very problematic for our countries, where we have also the huge challenge to meet the universal access goal by 2030. So that is really something challenging for our country if we don't have this kind of support, this kind of access to financing resources. So I think that to summarize, the main challenge will be a progressive energy transition, first. Second, more access to climate financing and more opportunities for private sector to mobilize resources to contribute in the energy investment in our sub-region. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks, Mr. Sar. This is very crystal clear. Now moving to Stephen Nzioka. Same question. What do you think would be the top priority for COP27?
Well, for Africa, what we think, mainly realizing that in the space of energy, in our country and in most of the African countries, we realize that the need for energy basically is in clean cooking. Because like in our country, we've moved up to 77% access of electricity. But 70% of our population still is using dirty fuels in cooking. So our take moving towards COP27, we would like to have something tangible that can be able to address the issue of clean cooking. Because when the fuels went up, we were moving in the right direction in terms of use of LPG, but now because of the prices of LPG going up because of what is happening in Ukraine, we have moved back to biomass use. So most of the population now currently, and not only in our country, but in most of the African countries, they are using the dirty fuels. Even some countries, they're above 90%. So we look forward to having something to do with clean cooking. Again, also the fertilizers. I mean, in agriculture, we realize that because of the crises that are happening all over the world, the prices for fertilizers went up. And most of African countries depend on agriculture. So the price, they are unsustainable. So the issue of green hydrogen, which is being proposed, is something that we're looking forward to having it on board so that we can address the issue of fertilizers and again also fuels for our vehicles. And moving forward, we are looking at financing for adaptation. So the issue of doubling climate finance is a critical issue for us. And again, also the global goal on adaptation. We would like to have the outcomes from the 4 workshops. And the new collective quantified goal on climate change. Or we would like to have the developed countries meeting the climate finance pledge, which from 2019 to post-2025, we look forward so that we can be able to address the challenges that we are meeting. We're also looking at the mitigation. We would like the developed countries to meet the ambitious NDC targeting so that we transition from the use of heavily relying on dirty fuels and technologies that pollute the environment to cleaner technologies in energy all over the world. So we are looking forward to issues on mitigation being addressed, and especially the developed countries meeting the ambitious NDC targets for 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Thanks very much. Also, from your side, what I understand that it's all related to the energy transition as well. There are a lot of points and there are a lot of different priorities, actually. They are all related to the energy transition. Thanks very much for this. Now, moving on quickly to our online speakers. So first, Mr. Mesfin Dabi Seboka, if you want to comment on the same, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. My reflection is a little bit much related to my country's perspective, actually. It might be also hold this for maybe for the region, the East African region as well. Maybe the top priority as far as Ethiopia is concerned is again the same as other panels described it as energy transition, but our top and primary priority might be the access, energy access issue. Our access rate is very low, probably one of the lowest in Africa. And in order to meet this access rate, we put forward a kind of ambitious goal to go universal electrification at the end of 2030. But the current access rate is a little bit more than 50%. So it's kind of very ambitious, and it also needs a huge investment, like investing $1 billion every year. So it needs a lot of investment. So in order to fill this part,
I think you're frozen, at least for us here in Bonn. Yeah, I see the other colleagues as well nodding. So perhaps, perhaps we come back to you later on if you still hear us. In the meantime, perhaps we can hear from our fourth speaker, Mr. Abdullahi Ahmed Ali from Somalia, if you can comment on the top priority for COP27 for you.
Good evening to you all. I hope you can hear me. And thank you for the opportunity. Actually, so fascinating to be participating in this wonderful event, and also speaking the priorities Africa should present in the COP27. I believe, and I consider this to be an African COP. I consider this should be a COP of action because, for example, my country, Somalia, the delegates are tired of going and attending conferences, hearing wonderful speeches and less action. So I believe this should be a call of action, and I believe Africa should prioritize putting forward a commitment, clear priorities, climate priorities. I think my colleagues also speak.
We can still hear fine, at least here in Bonn.
Thanks. So priorities, like my colleague, they have explained, I agree with them totally 100%, but I believe within the African continent, we are having divergent issues and some differences when it comes to priorities. But in a nutshell, as Africans, we should prioritize the following priorities, which includes, number one factor is fair access to climate funds and climate finance. And I think we need to look at and go back to the figure. If you now look at the amount of the pledges, I think the African continent of LDCs received less than 20% of the climate finance, and this is really a huge gap. It's also raised another climate justice question. As our countries are in the front line of climate impacts. And speaking of the climate justice, this also reminds me the fact that this COP, we need also to dedicate some time and effort to consider and discuss climate justice. And I think we should pay more attention to climate impacts our countries are suffering from. I also want to see more commitments, more priorities given to adaptation over any other climate action. And I think, as I speak now, for example, Somalia, we're facing almost a famine. Now it's more than a drought. 80% of the country is being hit by this recurrent drought. And almost 40% of the population was being displaced as a result of the drought. I think this also drives us to think about the total loss and damage as a result of these extreme events related to climate change. And finally, I want also to, like my colleague have said, energy transition in Africa is also another priority African delegates should put forward. And I think this is the right time to dedicate enough resources, discuss about and unpack the day-to-day challenges we face as a result of energy crisis that happens in the country. With that, my final priority should be moving away from the theories, moving away from the talks and negotiations, and considering to come up viable actions on the ground. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Many thanks for your intervention. And I totally hear you in terms of priority that should be implementing now the different goals that we have set and going for action. And just perhaps a word from my side on the climate impacts and adaptation that you mentioned. At the IEA, we published, I think it was last year or a couple of years ago, a report on the climate impacts that are already happening and that would be happening in the energy sector of a certain part of Africa. And we are seeing that this is really, really impacting. And if there is no adaptation action taken today, of course, it would worsen very much. But now perhaps let's move. I don't think we have still our.
Hello.
Yeah. Are you back?
Sorry.
Yes, please. Sorry, we've lost you.
Yeah. I do have some intermittent kind of internet connection, and probably I might also be out in a while, probably. But I'll speak very short and maybe
Sounds good.
To finish up on the access issue. Like I told you, it's a very huge investment, and we really need a lot of money in order to get to meet our target at the end of 2030, to go universal electrification at the end of 2030. And the other challenge from the generation side, for instance, our system is a hydro dependent, so we also have a plan to increase our energy mix. This will make sure our system, because the hydro systems are very vulnerable to climate changes. So we have a plan to increase our energy mix from solar, wind, and geothermal. And this is, again, needs also a huge amount of investment. And probably as a country, one of our top priorities might be to get some kind of support in order to implement some of these our plans actually. And probably in the other my other ideas might be given in the upcoming interventions. Thank you very much. I'll try to make it very short. Thank you very much.
No, thanks very much to you for concluding these very important remarks as well. And I'm happy to see that you're actually implementing the recommendation of our report. It was indeed like on hydropower in certain regions of Africa would be put onto a stress and therefore diversifying the energy mix, of course, with more renewables would be a better strategy going forward. So excellent. Now, bridging this, because you mentioned also, basically all of you mentioned the need for investments. And one thing that we are seeing, and that my colleagues Dan Wetzel mentioned before when presenting the preview of the report, was that today's fuel prices and also the food prices are increasing in Africa, and most of these services associated with them are becoming unaffordable for many Africans in some regions. And so looking at the access objectives and also some climate objectives and other type of development objectives as well, what would be, in your opinion, the best way that the international community can support the continent through this crisis, and how can climate financing best play a role in increasing energy investment in the continent? This is just another broad question. I would like perhaps to take it in reverse order, and if you could make it like in a couple of minutes maximum for each speaker, so we can preserve some time for Q&A later on. So please, Mr. Abdullahi Ahmed Ali first.
Thank you. As far as this question is concerned, I believe the pandemic, COVID-19, has exposed how Africa was vulnerable to the sudden change in the global markets, and we have seen how most of our countries have suffered from the pandemic. And again, Africa is and was never prepared. The Russian-Ukraine war also exposed how our systems and our governance cannot cope with the sudden changes. And speaking from this end, from Somalia, just weeks after the 2 weeks from the war, we have realized 20%, 30% increase in the food prices. And for the past 2-3 months, we have also realized another crisis in the energy pricing, as most of the energy service providers have increased the price due to sudden increase in the fuel prices. So this also reminds us the fact that it is our governments that can and that should provide subsidies to our fragile economies, and also better utilize the available international funds. I do believe international support is also needed, but however much we need such resources, including climate finance, I believe they cannot cope and they cannot provide every citizen's priorities and needs. And I think this is where we want to hold our governments accountable in terms of reliance. For example, in my country, 90% of the total basic utilities are imported from outside, and any slight change in the global markets hugely affects the consumers locally. And this is where the role of government is actually missing in terms of putting the citizens' priorities in the first place. Thank you very much. Allow me to stop here, and I invite my colleagues.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Moving on to Mesfin Dabi Seboka, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. With regards to the fuel price increment, actually this is highly interrelated to other commodities in Ethiopia. I mean, every price increment in the fuel, because every fuel, hydrocarbons they are imported from abroad. So we are highly impacted by global price increment. So everything is related to this fuel actually. But specific to, for instance, these fuels are mostly used by transport sector, and Some of the policy measures that the government put forward is actually not in the near future, but in the long term, to switch from fossil fuel-based kind of transportation to electric vehicles, for instance, and also like government also promote mass transportation. Railways are being built throughout the country, and then so such kind of policy measures will help us to resist with the price fluctuation of this fuel prices which are being imported from abroad. And also probably we can also use some renewables to fuel our transportation sector, for instance, biodiesel and biofuels, in order to combat with the fluctuation of this fuel price actually. But like I told you, we are not isolated from the international community. So anything that happens in the international community will definitely affect us. So we are currently suffering from these fuel prices, but we put forward some policy measures in order to cope with these things. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Mr. Ndioka?
Yeah, on this question, what the international community can be able to do, because we are facing the crisis in terms of fuel prices and food prices, we are suggesting that if we could have some support in terms of subsidy that does not have a long term on the prices, just for a short gap, so that once the crisis is over, then can be lifted on those subsidies. The second suggestion is that if we could have a swap on the debt with climate finance to help the countries which are facing these challenges to cope with the crisis. So swapping the debts that are increasingly on becoming a burden to the African countries with the climate finance, so as to help them to alleviate or cope with the crisis. Number three, we are suggesting that we need to increase climate finance into agriculture so that African can produce more food locally instead of importing their food. The other issue that we can be able to address is on the food, water, energy nexus. For example, if we invest on renewable energy, we have a lot of our farmers using the fossil fuel generators to pump water into irrigation. So if we can retrofit, finance the food, the nexus between food, water, and energy, we can be able to alleviate most of this by funding more of renewable energies in agriculture, especially in irrigation, so that they have less reliance on fuels that have become very expensive, and they utilize the natural sun and wind to be able to irrigate their farms to produce food. So, because we realize that agriculture being our mainstay is quite vulnerable to climate change, but yet we have a lot of sun in our country. So the other thing that we are suggesting is that we look forward to a lot of support in renewable energy being supported. That is wind, geothermal, solar, and even the clean cooking solutions that need to be supported. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks very much. And now, Mr. Sarr?
Thank you. For me, I think in front of this situation where you have fuel prices, raising fuel prices, and our willingness to meet the universal access goal, what I can think as an alternative is to have more funding for renewable energy and to facilitate the involvement of the private sector on energy investment. Because in our countries, I think we need to promote decentralized energy system. The energy could be generated locally and consumed locally, so that we will be more in a secure situation compared to what we are currently living now. But to be able to promote this, the funding of this renewable energy, we need a solution like more climate financing, also to enable the use of carbon finance as part of the solution, so that it will help to de-risk the investment that can attract the private sector to invest in many solutions like water pumping, and to address this water, energy, food security nexus that have been mentioned earlier by my colleague. And I think these are the main issues that we should focus on in our countries. And I think from our perspective in Senegal, we are trying to do a bit in terms of putting in place some facility to finance decentralized energy system for productive uses. So these are the new trends that we are now working on, and I think these are part of the solution. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now that you mentioned a little bit also carbon financing, this makes me, of course, wonder a little bit what are the right vehicles, right? Like we've discussing what type of projects could benefit most from international support, but then what are the right vehicles? And I know about your background in particular on carbon markets. I wanted to ask the whole panel in what you think would be the right vehicles for bringing this finance to the financial vehicles to bring in the right sources of finance to this project, and if you have any already some examples of projects that are working on the ground, and to in particular, perhaps if you could spend a couple of words on what you think the potential of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement could be for Africa in general. I know that the West African countries, they have an alliance working on this, and so again, like now in reverse, so starting from you, Mr. Sarr, first.
Thank you, because I'm in a situation to talk about it, because I work for 22 years in the Senegalese Rural Electrification Agency, and I had the opportunity to develop 2 carbon projects for facilitating the access to electricity, because we managed to develop 2 CDM projects that would generate revenues, and these revenues are used to facilitate access to rural communities to electricity by financing the indoor installations, because from the surveys that we have undertaken before, we noticed that people don't have problem to pay their bill, but the upfront investment is really an issue for these people. So using this kind of carbon finance revenue mixed with the subsidy given by the government, it facilitates a lot the access to electricity in rural areas. So I think with this new Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, we have some opportunities to develop carbon projects in line with access to electricity, and also to generate revenues for the main project developer, and mainly the private sector. It can facilitate their involvement in this sector. This is one aspect. The other aspect that we managed to do in parallel in our rural electrification program in Senegal is to develop a Gcf project. We've managed to develop a Gcf project of $80 million that enable us to electrify 1,000 villages in Senegal with solar mini grids. So this was a very interesting experience that we've gone through, and I think it is something that can be replicated in many African, West African, and African countries. So the approach is there, and the opportunity is there, and that is something that can be scaled up. So these are the 2 approaches that we have experimented in West Africa: the use of climate financing and the use also of carbon finance to have additional revenue to finance investment for electricity access. The last but not least is green bonds, because we have now also, as project in our countries, some initiative relative to mobilizing green bonds for the private sector who is involved in energy, productive use of energy system in West Africa. Thank you.
Excellent. This is very concise, but 3 examples that are really on the spot and to the spot. For you,
we have a similar experience in geothermal development, where we have successfully been able to utilize the carbon finance, and it has been successful. So again, also we are implementing 143 mini grids in 14 of our counties, and we are saying that we would like to use the carbon, the GCF to do that. So we are looking, because by using the mini grids, we are using green energy. So it's something that is going to reduce greenhouse gases in our environment. So 143 mini grids covering 14, the larger part of our country, I think will go a long way to use this climate change finance.
Many thanks. It's so interesting to see also different experience, but in some way also connecting in sense from different countries. And now perhaps hearing from Ethiopia first, and then from Somalia, if you can share some experiences.
Thank you very much. Our experience with regards to carbon finance. One experience I do remember is we used to have a rural education fund, and under that fund, we were able to tap some finance through GCF, and we were able to distribute solar home system. Like, I don't exactly remember the number of solar home systems, but like thousands of them actually were able to provide to rural households. And other carbon finance we do have a program called National Biogas Program, Ethiopian National Biogas Program. Under that program, we were able to build some household digesters to provide cooking and also electricity facility to rural households at the same time. And we are currently drafting or maybe designing a clean cooking program in order to scale up some of these financing schemes, also to scale up some of the activities that we have done in these 2 programs, the National Biogas Program and also the
I'm afraid we've lost you again. Are you still there with us? If not, let's move to the experience from Somalia.
Thank you once again for the opportunity. And as far as the kind of support we need, I believe it should start with the governance, and that entails the issue of capacity and capabilities, because normally we are blamed for having weak systems to apply and comply with the required rules or requirements and standards in order to access the available climate funds, for example, the GCF and the likes. And also unfortunately, our climate commitments, our climate targets, for example, if you look at most of the African NDCs, it actually lacks clear commitments. I mean, translating these commitments into bankable projects and usually poses another challenge, institutional challenge. And I also believe that creating conducive environment for private sector, because, for example, in our case, we have a very vibrant private sector who, as far now, applies or facilitates a supply of basic necessities, basic services, including water, energy, health, infrastructure as well. And special consideration should be given to developing countries, to frontline countries, to the countries who are mostly affected. I think most of the African countries qualify to be in that position, unfortunately. I also believe that African governments should focus more into having or are trying to unpack the day-to-day challenges. For example, if we now try, I give you one example, we have tried to apply a climate fund project, but we found the process took us for almost more than 3-4 years. By the time the project was given green light, the situation has already changed. I mean, so such scenarios need to be unpacked and addressed quickly. And I think I personally wish to see the country not really dependent on international support, but rather looking forward to innovative ways, innovative sources of funds. And I think for our case, the diaspora alone has provided, if I now try to give, I recall the aid mapping analysis for the past 3-4 years, the diaspora has set more money when you compare to the international donors, and there is a lot of money that can be channeled and if the government properly mobilizes such resources, the private sector, the crowdfunding or the local resource mobilizations, all these funds can be a better catalyst towards climate actions. And I believe climate finance is the key for Africa to overcome the climate challenge, because most of our NDCs, 90% of our NDC commitments are need support from the international development. And finally, allow me to say, for any African nation to improve our climate access finance, we need to work on our transparency and accountability. And this again goes back to our governance. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Also, these are very, very good points, in my opinion. Just wanted to see whether our Ethiopian speaker is back.
Yes, I'm back. Actually, I was about to finish. Actually, I have already wrapped up. Actually, we are currently working on designing a new program on clean cooking program in order to tap more on the carbon finance or maybe climate finance thing. So I think I have already wrapped up. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks very much to everyone. I just wanted perhaps we're running slightly over time, but I just wanted to check. We have some audience here in Bonn who has been very diligently waiting patiently for posing some questions. So I just wanted to open the floor to see if there is anyone in the room that might have some question for our distinguished panel. Please. Yes, sir. Can you please introduce yourself and by your name and affiliation?
I'm Gunnar Olesen with International Network for Sustainable Energy, and we're working with a number of African members of our network, and we have been, and my question is mainly to you who are developing the outlook for the African outlook. So, but also, of course, everybody is welcome to answer. Are you considering to take improved cook stoves and other solutions which are not going to a new fuel, but just using the existing fuel much more efficiently? Because we see that as a maybe more viable solution. We have organizations who have as efficient cook stoves for wood as you can do with LPG. So there's a really huge technical potential there. And also with, we heard your issues about going into sustainable mobility with electric cars, which are not so easy to get and they're expensive. But we see a lot of potential in the small-scale transport, two-wheeler, three-wheelers on electricity, which could, when there's been this enormous growth of two-wheelers, particularly in Africa, and if that could be electric in some ways, and there could be ways to do it, we think that could give really a boost to having a sustainable transport, which is where the local transport is just harmed by all this price hikes we have now? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Perhaps before turning into these questions, just to see, we might have the chance to have another question from the audience. If not, yeah, please.
I'm Judith Soletsky, and I'm also from this International Network for Sustainable Energy, where we are having these members in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And I would love to see, I see that the outlook is more towards the renewables, as you mentioned, that 80% of the investment will be until 2030, I think it was, in renewables. But I would like that you would be even more visionary, because there is a huge potential in new technologies on renewables, and there is wind energy potentials in Kenya, and I'm living in Denmark, where these huge windmills are developed right now, and there is a lot of sun in Africa. So I really would like that you would drop this coal and you would drop these fossils, and would be even try to get more investment into these revolutionary new technologies in Africa. And the main problem, as far as I see, that you can get loan in Denmark for different investments without problems, but in Africa there is a problem of investment per capita. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Of course, these are good considerations. Perhaps I would suggest we have 3 questions here. I would like perhaps to turn to my colleague Dan Wetzel, if he wants to answer those that he feels that he would like to, and then perhaps also to the speakers here, if you would like to answer the question about the 3-wheelers. How do you think in your, if you feel like responding, of course, in your transport sector, how do you see this competing, so to speak, with the development of electric cars? How the two compare? So first perhaps Dan, and then a last round with the speakers.
Yeah, so I'll sort of go in sequence of the questions. Improved cook stoves play a very huge role in access. We do define an improved cook stove as reaching clean cooking access. It's a first step. The idea from there is to progress further from that. But in rural areas, we expect around 60% of those gaining access by 2030 to do so through improved cook stoves. It does play a role in rural areas as well, but we see LPG and electricity playing a much larger role there. On 2 to 3-wheelers as well, we see a large uptake of those. And some of those, a good portion of those are electrified, because we're seeing production of electrified 2 to 3-wheelers, particularly in Asia today, really taking off. Now there's challenges in making sure we're getting those to Africa. That trade dynamic hasn't really taken off yet to the same extent as secondhand vehicle imports into Africa, but we see a lot of potential there. The one thing that's important to stress about thinking about electrifying transport is many countries in Africa today face reliability challenges with the grid, and predicating your mode of transport, especially if you need it for your business or daily transport purposes, is really difficult if you're having unreliable energy. So where we see those being taken up first is in urban centers, which do have stronger interconnections and more robust distribution systems, and particularly with something like a 2 to 3-wheeler, which uses less power draw, can run for a longer period of time on a single charge, and is a little bit more flexible in its use. So that's one of the areas that we see taking off, but it is in our outlook there. Now to the other question around the role of renewables versus fossil fuels going forward. So first, it's good to clarify that what we see is no further coal being built in Africa. So to your question on coal, that isn't playing a role going forward in Africa's future, because with the elimination of overseas financing availability from Africa, from China, we really see those streams of finance basically drying up, and anything in terms of that would go towards other investments instead, either in renewables or firming, such as hydro, and in some cases natural gas. So that's one thing to note, is only the plants that are under construction today get finalized, and after that we see no further coal investments. Now, on this tension, one of the key things is we're really looking at 2030 on this time horizon, and that leaves us 8 years, less than 8 years really. And there's a lot to get done, particularly on access. And I think particularly on clean cooking, we see the urgency of moving there means unprecedented rates. Even if you look at the best case examples in Indonesia today, many African countries would have to move faster than Indonesia has been doing on this. And so this really means all solutions need to be on all cylinders to be able to make sure we're reaching these targets. And additionally, when we look at some of the reliability challenges that we know are one of the reasons that industry has not flourished to the extent that we would hope in recent years, is because of high prices of electricity and unreliable electricity. And in many cases, providing that reliability at low cost today in some regions in Africa does work on gas. And in particular, in industry, direct use of gas for high temperature production, particularly in things like steel, it really becomes a very important source of energy going forward and becomes least cost. So this is one of those cases where some of the technologies have not caught up yet to make sure we're at a cost-effective implementation of those industrial solutions.
Thank you very much, Dan. And now just a few words if anyone from the panel would like to respond.
Yeah, maybe just to respond, like he has mentioned, for us to transition in Africa, really we need to focus as a means of transitioning from the dirty fuels to electric cooking and LPG. The clean cooking stoves need to be maybe part of the outlook. Because in Africa, a lot, on average, more than 70% of households use dirty fuels, and we need to improve energy efficiency in terms of the clean cooking solutions in terms of stoves. In our country, and I've seen around East Africa, I don't know, West Africa, they use a lot of two-wheelers in accessing the villages. A lot of transportation is being done on motorbikes, and we need to move into the direction of electric mobility on the two-wheelers and three-wheelers. We have a pilot project in one of the cities in our country where they are piloting on electric motorcycles in a city called Kisumu. We hope this will be also rolled out in other cities and counties so that we can be able to reach the villages using e-mobility. That was our starting point, and we've already started also bringing in e-buses. We hope that we can also have maybe an assembling factory in our country on e-mobility soon. That is one of our targets in terms of energy efficiency strategy in our country. On renewable energy, there was an ambitious project on coal, but because of increasingly demand on renewable energy and the renewable energy technologies becoming so cheap compared 10 years ago, like solar technologies have come down by 80% in our country, and I believe also on wind technology. So, and again also the our call to move from coal to renewables, it has been shelved. That is the idea of going coal way is no more part of our country. So we are moving in the right direction. We hope by 2030, we'll be at 100%. Currently, we're at 70% of installed capacity of our electricity generation is from renewable. And we are calling on the independent power producers who are using diesel. Actually, the thought is on transition, we can be able to get gas from the neighboring countries like Tanzania and Mozambique, and we retrofit those power stations into use of gas as we move on to fully 100% renewable.
Thank you very much. And I've seen that, yeah, Usman Sar had also wanted to make
just few comments on the idea of revolutionary new technologies and also the electrical mobility. Yes, for this new technology, but I just want to put the emphasis on two issues: the technology transfer issue and also the just transition issue. We welcome this technology, but provided that the development and the transfer of this technology is ensured in our country, so that at the end of the day, it will not end up with job loss and no skill enhancement in the country. If we have to import all the spare parts to use this technology, it will not end up, there is no added value for us. So I think it should be a process where all these issues have to be taken into consideration so that we can appropriate the technology and make it sustainable for our community and in a just transition way. So these are the main issues I wanted to raise, and I think we are on this way and we are working on that, and hopefully we can meet this target by 2030. Thank you.
Thanks very much to you as well. Just let's see if there is any final remarks also from our colleagues that are online, from our speakers from Ethiopia and Somalia. If not, okay. I can't hear any. Sorry, I cannot see if there is any hand raised from where I am, so I hope it's fine. If not, I would like just to thank you very much to all the panelists and the presenters today. I found this, I learned a lot as well myself, so I found this conversation very, very enriching. I think it would be very difficult to summarize the last hour and 15 minutes of discussions, but there are a few things that I keep in mind. The first one is that there is an extremely challenging situation in the continent because there are several crises that are happening at the same time. With the climate crisis, it is at the same time a long-term one, but a short-term one as well. We heard about adaptation problems that are already happening. And there are some opportunities, but these opportunities can come only if there are the right vehicle of financing that comes with them. And we've seen that there are already some good examples that are already happening and are being implemented on the ground. So on the IA side, we would like to thank all the speakers. We would like also to remind, as Daniel mentioned, that the report will be out, the African Energy Outlook will be out in a few days, at the 20th of June, if I'm not mistaken. And so we look forward for you to read it and also to provide feedback for these continuous discussions that I think would be needed to put and to bring Africa, but generally the whole world, onto the Paris Agreement path. So with that, please join me in thanking the speaker and with a round of applause, and we consider this session closed. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next week. Thank you very much. So welcome.
I've given it to somebody else that's been sent to represent the minister.
Ah, okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
C'était vraiment un plaisir. Moi, j'ai entendu parler de vous. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Yeah. Moi, j'ai entendu parler de vous parce que moi, je collabore très souvent avec le BAI. Parce que moi, je travaille beaucoup avec le CIS. Je suis dans le... Moi, je suis Luca Loré et je travaille dans le groupe d'experts des changements climatiques de l'OCDE et de l'AIE, et on écrit des papiers techniques sur l'article 6 et sur le marché des carbones.
Oui, on est ensemble.
Et je vous votre nom et prénom sur plusieurs rapports avec Axel Michelot.
Exactement.